Thank you. I'll do just a brief intro. This is the May 27th Charter Review meeting of the City Council. The purpose of tonight's meeting is to review sections 4 through 7 of the City Charter. We have Attorney Cliff Shepard on the call with us tonight. You should have received some documents in advance of tonight's meeting. You should have received an updated modification of the text or proposed modifications to the text for sections 4 through 7, along with a backup memo from Chief Smith with regards to one of the particular sections. We do have Jacob as our moderator in the background tonight. He did receive some public comments, so at some point during the meeting, he will need to read those to enter them into the record. And with that, I will turn the floor over to Cliff so he can start his presentation of section 4.
Well, thank you, Mike. I'm going to go ahead and share the screen now, and then we'll jump right in. It says share. I think that should be now up for you all to see. Yes, I see heads nodding. Okay, so before I get into the substance, let me tell you that we're still fiddling is probably an appropriate word, fiddling with the outline of how we present you the information. And it got a little more complicated because before, as a typical attorney, I considered only myself. It's what I like to do the best. But apparently I'm supposed to consider staff as well. And so I did when they told me, hey, by the way, we have comments too. And so for a colorblind person, doing anything color coded is a dangerous endeavor. But what I did is I copied the sections and pasted the sections that we're going to go over. And this is, unless you all give me additional guidance, this is what we will do going forward. And I think it's yellow, and the yellow color, if I'm right that it's yellow, is mine. The other color, which I think is gray, is from staff, and that could be the police chief, it could be Mike, it could be the city clerk or deputy city clerk. In this case, I think those comments that are staff are from the police chief and Mike and the city clerk. I think all of those were covered, but it could be anyone else who has been consulted on staff about a given section and has input. So those are the things. And when you go through them, you might say, well, I don't understand. I see this as highlighted, but I don't actually find the language that's discussed below. And that's because in some cases, the staff is suggesting additions. In some cases, they're suggesting deletions. So the color coding is just to give you a clue of where to look. It's not going to be that you're going to find the exact language, which is why at the conclusion of the comments and the reasons for the discussion, I have, after all of that's taken into account, how that section would read if you assumed all those changes were agreed to. So with that being the mechanism by which I presented this memorandum, if you have any comments along the way about how it would be clearer or better, I'm all ears. Anybody on that before we move forward? Okay. All right, so the first section tonight is mayor duties and powers. The vast majority of the changes that are coming from me here are based on clarity, punctuation, and or gender neutrality. I think they're self-explanatory. If anybody has a question, I'm happy to go through that. The substantive change here came from the police chief, and it was based on the emergency powers of the mayor, which are somewhat unusual in my experience, in that they say straight up, as it currently is written, that the mayor, by his own authority, which obviously that was one of the changes we suggest, takes control of the government, including the police department, for a period not to exceed 72 hours and can be extended. The police chief, correctly in my view, based on the fact that I have not seen it anywhere else, doesn't mean that you should change it, but does mean when he says, I've never seen this, he's not wrong. That the taking over of the police department in a command structure by an elected official is probably not the right way to go. So what we changed it to, after looking at his comments and trying to make them mesh with mine, is we eliminated the reference to the police. So there is the possibility, unless y'all want to change it, that the government for a short period of time can be run by one human being, the mayor, whomever that might be, but it would be through directives to the police chief, not from the mayor directly to line officers or other officers in that regard, whether they be lieutenants, captains, and so forth. So not unlike it operates today, except that any directions that aren't directly carried out through the police chief are with discussions through the city manager. This would eliminate the manager part of the equation potentially, but essentially you would still go to the chief, and then the chief would be in charge of his or her staff and officers. So that's the idea here. And then the section of how it would read with all the changes is self-explanatory. And if anybody's got any questions on any of that now, I will shut up and listen.
And the first hand I see raised is Councilor Dumont.
I don't have any questions. I think this is wonderful clarification, and I like the delineation of authority with if the mayor is needed to take over the city government, the mayor would still then tell the police chief what needs to be done, the professional in the policing field. So I'm very comfortable with this. On an aside, when you read something like this in the charter, you wonder what the story was behind how it got there. But we're fixing it now, so yay.
I'm going to suspicion, and that's all I can offer, that it's a different time and a different view of the way government should operate, as is indicated probably most prominently by the fact that everything that can be mail is mail. We generally screw things up when we have the opportunity. Let me add to this, by the way, as a whole other reason why you might want to consider it, is that the legislature, in its wisdom, without intending to offend anybody who loves the legislature, I don't happen to be a fan, but if you do, God bless you. But they passed a bill that went into effect and was approved by the governor on April 19th called Combating Public Disorder. And if you are not familiar with it, you need to be, because what it says is local governments, that's you guys, must protect persons and property from unlawful assemblies. And if you don't, sovereign immunity is waived. And the reason that's important to you is that's the thing that protects you from individual lawsuits. And it also protects the city from having to pay out more than $300,000 per claim for tort claims. And the basis for that liability is what they call, and this is the problem among others, an inappropriate response. I don't know what that is, but here's what they were trying to do versus what they actually did. What they were trying to do is avoid a Portman-like response, which they would view as a non-response, where a certain area was basically dubbed, I forget what they called it, but what it amounted to was the lawless zone, and buildings burned and were looted and such as that. So that was the goal. But by putting in the language as an inappropriate response without any definition of what that would be, if, for example, a police officer were to use excessive force, or when somebody argued was excessive force, that could be deemed an inappropriate response. So could a number of other responses, whether it is nonviolent or violent or something in between, because again, what's an appropriate response? I'm making this point obviously because for all the elected officials, whether I represent you only temporarily or for longer term, this is an area where you have individual exposure that you probably didn't plan on signing on for when you ran for office. So you need to be aware of it. You also need to be aware of it from the standpoint of this is another time in which the legislature has, despite what they may tell you when they campaign for the job, have intruded significantly onto your home rule authority. And that's important because rather than you being able to make local decisions that are based on what you see by intel on the ground at that time and place when you're making those decisions, they're going to judge it from Tallahassee with this inappropriate response language, which means lawyers, not unlike myself, can have a field day. So I wanted to bring that to your attention.
And I'd like to bring to everyone's attention the gender of the majority of the state legislature.
I didn't say that.
I did.
So let's go to Mayor Pro Tem, unless there are any questions on Section 4. Last call for Section 4. All right. So the Mayor Pro Tem, there were very few changes here. It was obviously gender neutrality from us and based on staff. And I think this was from the clerk or the acting clerk, deputy clerk, is a reflection of how elections are actually handled and when they're final, and they're final in not only your city, but every other city when they're certified by the supervisor of elections. And so that's the suggestion for that add, and that is what is suggested to add to section 5, along with the changing from his absence to the mayor's absence. Any questions on that section? All right. Meetings of council. There was a lot more to this in terms of the how long it lasted, but in terms of the purposes of those changes that we made here, they were gender neutrality issues, obviously. One of the substantive changes that I suggested is there's an ability to call a meeting, a special meeting, when a majority of members agree to a request of another member of council, but because they can't do that and without violating sunshine law, it's done in this process, or at least originally it's done through the city manager's office or the city clerk's office. But it uses the word poll, and you are not allowed to poll, even if you're the city clerk. Polling is in fact a sunshine law violation. So we changed that to determine. And if that seems like a distinction without a difference, basically the difference that is a legal concern is I'm not trying to count votes. I'm simply trying to determine whether I have sufficient support to put out a notice. So I'm not asking you, do you vote on a given issue? I'm asking you, do you want a meeting on an issue? And that makes a difference, at least legally, even if it doesn't in your own minds. So the rest of these changes, I think, are self-explanatory. There was a request by the clerk's input that instead of it being the clerk, male or female, to actually go and deal with the elected officials, that job would best be handled by the city manager, who will then essentially let the clerk know whether there is sufficient support to have the special meeting, and then the clerk would put out the notice. And again, unless there's any questions, we did add electronically. That's obviously the current way most of these things are done. There was a suggestion by the clerk's office, which to take out the in-person notice, but I left that in there because it's a possibility, maybe even a likelihood, that the clerk would see one or more of you in the case of a special meeting before they would actually be able to email you or send to your usual place of residence a notice. And so that would be perfectly fine. And these are for consistency with the practice, and as I understand it, and procedures that are already being utilized, even if it's not verbalized that way in the charter. So that's for section 6. Any questions on section 6? All right, this is good tonight. All right, council rules. This one, my only change was to change the last sentence where it said keep a journal of its proceedings. Sunshine law requires us to keep minutes. So we're going to use that term, or at least that's my suggestion, as opposed to journal, which would have been a term probably more appropriate back when there was no sunshine law, when the charter was initially created. And staff added to strike the words books and papers. I basically think as redundant, because if you're providing all the pertinent records, those would include books, papers, receipts, et cetera, So those are the changes there. And you see the section that has how it would read with all of those changes. Are there any questions on section 7? I see no nodding of heads nor raised hands. Mike, do you have any raised hands on your screen somewhere?
I do not have any raised hands. But I do know that now that takes us through section 7, I believe Jacob has some public comments that now might be the appropriate time for him to read those into the record.
All right, give me 1 second. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So we have we have
Jacob,
two public.
Jacob, before you start, we do have one hand raised. Councilor.
Okay.
Jacob could have gone first, but my question's not on any one individual section. It's more of a larger overarching question. we have now made changes to 4 sections, 2 in the parking lot to revisit to make changes to. Like with regard to gender neutrality, I take it that will be one piece on the ballot for the voter.
That would be my intention.
I'm guessing that the voter's not going to have each section and all of these different changes in each individual section, where it ends up being a 5 to 10 page ballot.
Well, it may be a 5 to 10 page ballot, but that won't be the reason. Let me explain. There will be one. First of all, the way these things are done is you have a summary and a title. The title has to be, I think it's 15 words or less, which is shall the Jacksonville Beach Charter be amended to make it gender neutral throughout? That would be actually that would be the summary. The title would be gender neutrality. Could be that simple. And the summary stated the way I'd said it would be 75 words or less. So those are the two things that are actually people will see in the voting booth, or if they're voting online or early voting, or however it works. But the actual amendments, the actual language will be as they are as it's currently written, with all the strike throughs of language that's taken out, underlines of new language added. So if I will say, probably most, maybe even the great majority, never actually read the language. They just read the title and the summary and the yes, shall it be changed, yes or no. They don't actually go pull out the detail, but we have to provide it, and it will be provided in an ordinance when you actually send this to the ballot, with all of the things, the title, the summary, and the actual changes. And it will be long if you make a lot of these as, yeah, we want to make these changes. And that will be there so they can actually physically read, okay, well, what are you exactly changing? And why are you changing his to the mayor? And why are you taking the word journal out? They can actually see what it says, because the summary has to be a fair synopsis, quote unquote, of what the amendment does, but it is not supposed to be a verbatim of what the amendment actually is. And that is why, when you have seen in the past challenges at the Florida Supreme Court for constitutional changes, sometimes they get kicked off the ballot for being misleading. That's why the summary portion has to be it has to be brief, but it also be as accurate as it can be within the 75 word limitation. So that's the way it works. So you will have one amendment that will say gender neutrality, and it'll be real short in terms of what they're voting on. But you can imagine, given how many changes we've already had in just 7 sections, that the actual amendment itself creating gender neutrality will be long.
So my concern is voter fatigue. They're not going to make it to the end of the ballot. And I would suggest that once we get through these 60 sections of the charter, we decide which ones we feel are most urgent to go in front of the voter to be able to get their attention. And we may want to hold off on those that, whatever the number is, we might want to hold off on the others for a later date, possibly the next election, if there's a lot of them, the next election after that, possibly the one after that, because we don't want to have voter fatigue and overwhelm individuals who, we've been in this for years, and they're all of a sudden just kind of presented with it in a voting booth, to be able to get a true feeling of what it is that people want. But we can't do that until we're done with figuring out what changes we want. And then I would suggest that we rank order what those changes would be and in their importance for us to be able to achieve our goals.
I think we discussed that exact plan and agreed on that at our last meeting.
We kind of did, but I don't know if it was clearly stated that
I was
this
my
would be the
understanding
process.
that was sort of a parking lot issue as well, that when we get through, a decision will be made by you all as to what we want to put on the ballot, right away, or by then it'll be, I guess, in December, but that'll be on the very next election, and then what would be postponed to the following election and so forth. And that's up to you all. It obviously is dependent upon how many actual questions and summaries we'd have to put together. And if the rate at which we're going now, we're probably up to at least 4. Because the gender neutrality is one. And then you look at the other things, and that's not because there's 2 of them that are in the parking lot. We don't know what will be done. I'm assuming some. So if you exclude those, you may be up to as many as 6. And are we even a third of the way through? And so, whether there's ballot fatigue or not, I guess that's an open question. As I said, the summaries and the questions themselves are very short. And what you find in most elections, I'm sure everyone here reads everything. I don't, but most voters, they just look, okay, the question, the answer sounds good to me. But that is the call that you need to make as elected officials as to how much you want to throw at your voters.
And a lot of that will depend on how many state constitution changes there are. It's going to be a mid-year election. So all of these changes will be at the end of the ballot, and there's always voter drop-off. And if we're changing the charter, our little local constitution, I would like as much input as possible. So we might want to we will need to peter it out a little each election to be able to get a feel for the true position of the residents, of the voters.
Yeah, I agree that would be the case.
I see Councilor Golding has her hand raised.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on what Ms. Dumont was saying. I agree that I would like to see, and of course we can discuss this when we get to the parking lot, but personally, I think it's really important that our citizens understand what the changes are that we're bringing before them. And I want to give them every opportunity to be able to understand those changes. And if we have too much stuff on the ballot, I don't want our charter approved by people who are just checking boxes because there's too
a bunch
much
of them
on
to check.
Yeah, exactly. Or not even checking any boxes at all because there's too much stuff on there. So, I mean, that's just, I don't think any of us want that. So, yeah, I look forward to us discussing this when we get to it, and finding out a good solution for what we want to put before the voters this next election.
And seeing no other hands raised, I think now we can kick it over to Jacob for the public comments.
Okay, we had 2 public comments from one person named Nathan Griffin. He lives at 515 4th Avenue South in Jacksonville Beach. And his comment said this: questions. How has an aspect of the city charter not been updated since within 5 years of the conclusion of World War II, over 70 years ago? Which city office / department is responsible for reviewing the city charter? I would like it to be added to the record that the city should maintain its current ratio of residents to liquor licenses, but update the census data to the most recently completed / certified. Thank you, Nathan Griffin. And then his next comment was, the only other section in the city charter, aside from section 2, that uses the census as a reference point is section 3, and it mandates that the most recent official Florida state and federal census, the official Florida state and federal census be used. Section 2, pertaining to liquor or whiskey, has not been amended since the inception of the city charter and specifically states federal 1950 census. It seems odd and slightly disingenuous to have one section codified to say current and another not. The city charter specifies a ratio, thus providing the possibility of a fluctuating number in line with population growth, not a static limit to be unchanged and not account for a majority of the city population or a single person on the city council. I don't believe anyone on the council could have been counted in the 1950 census. Thank you. And that's all.
Thank you, Jacob.
You're welcome.
Are there any other comments by City Council on sections 4 through 7 that we reviewed this evening?
No other comments.
Okay, thank you. I think that concludes our meeting for tonight. Our next meeting will be on June 24th And that meeting will cover sections 8 through 14 of the city charter. Was council okay with the format that you received the information in for tonight's meeting, where it was a combination of both Cliff's comments as well as city staff's? All heads
Yes, but I'm like, wow, we only got to spend 30 minutes together. When was the last time we only spent 30 minutes together and we could get out of a meeting in time for the local news? Not
Seems
that
like we
anybody
should-
watches that anymore.
Seems like all meetings should be by Zoom then, doesn't it?
Yep. Okay, so we'll see you all back here for June 24th to discuss sections 8 through 14 by Zoom at 5:30 p.m. Thank you all and have a good night.
Enjoy
you,
your
guys.
holiday.